Hello, friends. We're back at episode 176 of the Our Weekly Highlights podcast. This is the weekly podcast where we talk about the latest great resources that have been shared every single week at rweekly.org. It is basically your one-stop shop for curated R content made by the community and for the community. My name is Eric Nance, and I'm delighted you join us from wherever you are around the world in your favorite listening device or wherever you're tuning in. And, well, once again, I am flying the plane solo here again this week. Mike is still heads down on his urgent project that he's tidying up now. Hopefully he'll be back next week and we can hear all about his adventures. But nonetheless, we got some great highlights to talk about today, just you and me. We'll have a little cozy session here. But, of course, our weekly project itself is driven by the community in the form of our curators. And our curator this week was Colin Fay, the author and architect of all things Golem, which, by the way, congratulations go to Colin and his team at ThinkR for the release of Golem version 0.5 that just got released. We'll put a link to their announcement blog post in the episode show notes. But nonetheless, he had tremendous help, as always, from our fellow Our Weekly team members and contributors like you around the world of your pull requests and other suggestions. Speaking of Shiny, have you been here before? If you create an application that's used by, say, more than just you, you get it done, you get it released, everything seems fine, and then you get that user feedback. This can be both a good thing and maybe not so good thing, depending on your perspective. A lot of times in my experience, the feedback would be, you know what, Eric, the app looks good, but it's just kind of slow compared to some of the other ones I use. And I'm thinking to myself, boy, where did I go wrong? There wasn't anything completely obvious, right? Well, sometimes that puts you in the situation of trying to get to the bottom of this, because in the end, the user experience of your Shiny app is a critically important piece to obviously get your users on board and to make sure that the application is having a sustained life cycle, if you will. So you want to get to the bottom of this, right? But you're not quite sure where to start because the term profiling may give you a little bit of fear when you hear that. But no fear here. We got a great blog post that showcases a couple different tools that you can utilize along with a new tool that I wasn't aware of to look at different aspects of your Shiny app's performance. And in particular, we're going to be talking about a blog post from the Epsilon blog that was authored by Harsh Verma, one of their data scientists and developers at Epsilon, where he is talking to us about the different ways you can go about profiling that Shiny application that has given you maybe a little bit of performance fits, if you will. There are a couple different perspectives that he highlights here, the first of which is trying to figure out just, you made all those inputs, the elements that you can use in your Shiny app to enter text, change a slider value, drop down menus and whatnot that the user is interacting with. And of course, those are probably going to feed into some type of outputs in your app, maybe a visualization, a table of data, which we'll hear more about later, and other, output, maybe HTML widgets, for example. And in between, you probably have a set of what are called reactive objects that are helping kind of facilitate processing into objects that are going to be continuously updated depending on, say, inputs that are changing or other factors that are going on the client side. And as you build up more of these, it can be pretty easy to lose track of just what is actually connected to what and just how much, you might say, chatter is happening between what the user sees and what the backend is producing to get to the outputs that the user sees. And that's where the first tool that Harsh highlights here is the React log. The React log is something I hold close and dear to my Shiny heart as a wonderful way to visualize this dependency graph of your inputs, your downstream reactives that are feeding into the outputs of your application. And trust me when I say, maybe it starts simple, but as you build complexity, especially when you add modules in the mix, this can be a lot of things to keep track of. So the React log is a widget that will display an interactive flowchart of sorts where you can basically run the application in a typical flow, and then you can stop that and then put the React log in focus where it's going to let you traverse through that previous session where you were clicking inputs and then generating those outputs. So you've got a great way to kind of stop the steps, so to speak, so you can hone in on them further. And it's got all the connections between these inputs, reactives, and outputs in a very clear diagram. Again, highly interactive as well, so you can zoom in on certain points. You can also filter based on different names of inputs. You get the state of the inputs, such as whether they're ready for something new, whether they're actually calculating, or the process of invalidation, where now they know something's wrong in that particular upstream dependency, or I should say outdated. So it's got to do some recalculation and whatnot. So this is a great way for you to see maybe you have a lot of reactive processing in between an input and a downstream output. Maybe there are opportunities to refine that a bit. And really seeing that graph in front of you is a wonderful way to highlight just how complex that application's dependency graph has actually become. And again, I hold the React log very close to my dev toolbox. And if you want to hear more about React log itself, other than this little few minute overview I gave you, you'll want to tune into a previous episode of the Shiny Developer Series that we have linked to in the show notes, where we sat down with the architect of the React log from the Shiny team, Barrett Schlurke, for a really fun conversation about the enhancements he made to React log many years ago. Now, that's great to kind of get the overall picture of your dependency layout in your application. But there's also the fact of, well, when you're actually doing the calculations, what's really going on in terms of resource usage and time spent? That's where Prof is, another wonderful package in the R community, authored by Winston Chang, also a member of the Shiny team. That's where it comes to play to really help you in these situations. It can be used for things besides Shiny apps, but it lends very nicely to Shiny apps as well. The flame graph is a great way to see, a snapshot of just the number of steps or functions that are actually being called in these different operations that you're running in your application, and then seeing just how long they're taking, because the x-axis, the horizontal axis of this flame graph, is the time spent in this application to create or produce the result of that function call. And this is where you can maybe see perhaps there's a data processing step that's just taking a lot of time, and you can hone in on these different bars of these different pieces of your app functionality and start to see just what's really happening here. It's a great way to, again, pinpoint the bottlenecks and figuring out just how complex some of these operations actually happen to be. So a lot of times the time spent is probably where you're going to most focus on, but again, it will have other outputs in terms of memory usage and other metrics that might be helpful to you. Now, this isn't like an either or. I think they both complement each other quite well, and that's what Harsh talks about in the middle of the post. There isn't really a thing about which one is better. It's more about these are giving you different perspectives on the complexity of your Shiny application, from that dependency graph all to just what is actually happening when the code's being executed. And then his post concludes with a new tool, new to me for sure, called shiny.ticktock. And this is not an R package. This is actually a JavaScript utility where you can simply include this into your application with simply a call to a JavaScript script that's linked to in the blog post as part of your way in Shiny, where you can arbitrarily execute a JavaScript, script file. You just feed in via the tags $script function call and feed in the actual CDN link to this utility. And then once you have that in your app, you can just run your app as usual, say in your local setup, do much like what I mentioned in the React log, just go through a typical usage. And then to view the output, you're going to go into your browser's developer tools or browser tools, depending on which browser you're using. This is often what I'm using to look at the CSS behind certain elements, especially trying to theme things like my Quarto presentations or other Shiny apps with BSlib or whatnot. But there's also a JavaScript console in this browser tools where you can type in JavaScript commands on the fly. And so he's got a narrative here for which commands you can run here, such as showing all the measurements in this job that were produced by the JavaScript utility. You can download all these into a CSV if you want to post-process them into R or other languages. And you can get a nice summary report, also in HTML format, where you could look at that, as a separate web page. And it's kind of like a hybrid of the flame graph from ProfViz, albeit it's a little more organized, a little more streamlined, you might say. But it's also got color coding based on what are the outputs, also for calculations that are happening on the server, such as server-side loading or whatnot. And then also custom message handlers, which you might be utilizing in your app. But that's an interesting way for you to kind of get a quick take on how long some of these processes are taking. Kind of like emerging between maybe not so much emerging between the React log and the ProfViz visualizer, but it's an interesting take on it nonetheless. And what's nice is you could use this in your production apps. I don't believe it's causing a performance hit, although I haven't tried it yet. So you may want to, try that out yourself before you put it in production right away. But you can most certainly use this in a development version of your application locally as a quick way to get that, more streamlined profiling output. So as always on our weekly highlights, I learn something new every time I talk about these great stories. So I will be adding Shiny TikTok to my developer toolbox alongside, again, much love to the React log package, and ProfViz has always been very illuminating in my Shiny profiling adventures. So excellent blog post by Harsh, and yeah, really looking forward to playing with Shiny TikTok after this. I can recall, I would say many years ago as I was first getting into the R community, fresh into my day job and fresh off my dissertation in the way back years of, say, 2007, 2008. Again, to date myself, I've done that too much on this podcast episode already. Nonetheless, one of the things that was a bit of a challenge at the time was finding a really neat way to create polished looking tables outside of the typical LaTeX type setup. Nothing against LaTeX, but it gave me quite a bit of fits in my grad school days. You fast forward to today, and we have what I call an embarrassment of riches with how you can create really polished, aesthetically pleasing, powerful tables, both in the static format, but also in the interactive format. And I'm really a big fan of the interactive format. Hence, I was psyched to give a submission to the recent Posit Table contest with an interactive table. And the package that drove much of my contest submission was reactable. And it was a thrill to see, or I should say, to meet the author of Reactable, Greg Lynn. And it was a thrill to actually meet the author of Reactable, Greg Lynn, from Posit at the recent PositConf. I just, thanked him many times for Reactable. I just had a tremendous time using it. So Reactable gives you, again, yet another great way to create a really nice looking table in R. And our tutorial to talk about this, of how to change it from a static representation to a very interactive table, is coming from Albert Rapp, who returns to the highlights once again. It's been a little bit, Albert, but we're great to have you back on here. And he is a business analyst working on some really interesting AI and ML stuff, apparently. He's also producing great content on his YouTube channel, so you should check that out if you haven't already. But he wrote a recent blog post with an associated video tutorial on how you can create an interactive table with Reactable with a few lines of code and some great examples throughout. I really love making tables in R. Some might say I am the table sometimes. That's a little inside joke for some of you. But nonetheless, let's get right into it, shall we? So as usual, let's find some fun data to put in this table. And even though it's not the focus of this tutorial, the GT package by Richie Owen has a great set of built-in data sets. And yes, it happens to be with maybe some of my favorite food, pizza, of course. So he's got Albert sets up with the a filtered data set of this pizza place data set for the pizza sales from Hawaii. Man, that's on my bucket list to go to someday, maybe someday. Nonetheless, he does a little processing. We got a nice little tidy table here with the sales by month and quarter and the revenue that's being generated at that particular time. So what's nice is if you just want to get started right away with this tidy data set, you just feed it into the reactable function. Feed in that data set, and you've got yourself a nice interactive, already kind of interactive table, because in the blog post, you see this in action. It shows by default the first 10 rows, and there are actually 12 rows, one for each month. And you'll see at the bottom a toggle already to go to the next set of rows. But Albert didn't have to write any code for that. It was already in the table function by Reactable. So you already got a little interactivity all in the way, but this is just using the default column name. So of course you might want to spice things up a bit. So the first step is to add better, human, you might say human label type column names. Now this is where there is a contrast to the GT package, where in GT it very much follows a ggplot or piping kind of flow where you can iteratively modify or add to the elements of your table. With Reactable, everything is basically done in one particular function call, but with parameters that have a lot of associated subparameters or general structures inside. One of those is, for the case of column labels, you want to leverage the columns argument of Reactable and feed in a list with each list element named to the particular column you want to add an attribute to. So in this example, he's adding the new names of these columns using what's called the calldef function, also part of Reactable, where you can feed in different aspects that you want to tweak in this column. And in this case, it's just tweaking the name of the column. So once you get the hang of that, very easy to now have nice looking labels in your table of column names. Now, that's just the table on its own. Maybe you want to start thinking about how you want to publish this or share this with the community. So you want to add a title and subtitle. There are ways in Reactable, if you know CSS and JavaScript, you can add almost anything you want to these tables. But there has been another great package in the R community that I've often used. In fact, I use this for my table contest submission as well. It is you might say an extension to Reactable called Reactable Formatter, or FMTR. I'm just spelling out formatter there. And this package is authored by Kyle Kuila. Hopefully I'm saying that right. But he or she. But Reactable Formatter has a handy set of functions. Two of them are adding a title and adding a subtitle, and letting you change the style of those should you wish. Whereas Albert is able to change, say, the font weight of the subtitle to not be bold, but to be a normal type weight of font. So we've got a nice title above the table. But if you look at the table in the post, you notice that the revenue column is not quite nice yet because it's in that typical decimal notation. But we're talking about money here in US dollars. That's what the data set's using. So in that calldef function, you can change much more than just the name of a column. You can also change the format of the cells, and that's using the cal format function, where this could be anything from like a date, or in this case, currency, or even customizing a custom format of your own. So here, Albert just simply specifies as the USD for the currency, type, and then to add separators, i.e. the commas between each three digit for larger revenue. And now you got a table that has, nicely formatted, lined up values of revenue in that last column. Now, as you look at this table, you notice that we don't just have month, we also have quarter as well. Well, wouldn't it be nice to be able to let the user kind of toggle easy navigation between these groups? Maybe they're more interested in, say, the second quarter or the fourth quarter or whatnot. Well, reactable gives you a nice way to add groups. And again, this could not be more simple in the reactable construct because there's a parameter called group by. You feed in the name of the column that you want to use as your grouping. And right away, you'll see in the output from the blog post, you've got a nice collapsible element next to each quarter, a little caret arrow, if you will. You click on that, and now you've got the month sales and revenue showing up. And you can expand all of them. You can expand none of them. You get to choose, and now we have an even more interactive table for you to play with. Looking nice here, right? Well, maybe let's take it up a notch if we want to share this with, say, a stakeholder or the community. You might want some nice, summaries for each of these quarters as well. And what can we do for that? Well, what we can do there is we can say, okay, in the quarter view with everything collapsed, what if we want to add all the values under sales so that displays when it's like nested. But when you unnest it, then you get the individual values right below it. So that's where you can now add an aggregate call to that call def of the sales column. And you can choose which aggregation method you want to do, such as the average with mean, or in this case, a summarization or sum. So that's great. Now you can have for each group the total sales showing up in that default view with everything collapsed. Again, we're talking about interactive tables, right? Well, what if you want to, instead of point and clicking, you want to filter for a particular month? Well, reactable again has a handy little parameter in colldef called filter. Easy for me to say. Has a handy little parameter in the colldef called filterable, where you enable that toggle to true. And then that particular column now has a nice little text box right under the column heading where you can type in the name of a particular, say, month you want, and it will auto-complete, or I should say dynamically update based on the first few letters. So I just start typing JA, I'll immediately get January showing up under the quarter one, grouping. Again, very easy way to add filtering elements right away. You could have done that with sales as well, but in the end, this is a great little showcase of even more interactivity without any custom CSS or JavaScript required. Now hold that thought for a second because we're going to dive into that a little bit here, because what if at the very bottom of this table, you want, a common question to be answered of just what is the exact total of all the year's revenue and all the year's sales? So there is a way to do this a couple different ways in Reactable. One of which is adding a table footer using our code to basically define a custom function that takes as inputs the values for that particular column and the name of it, if you wish. If you want to do some of it, you can. And that's where you can use any ordinary R function. In this case, he's using the sum function again to summarize to add up all those revenue values. And then from the scales package, he's making sure that's represented in the currency format using the scales dollar function. Again, that's based in R. That's not based in Reactable's formatting. And once you do that, yeah, it does work, but there's a little nuance here. Let's say you want to do that filtering after all. Maybe you want to go to January instead using that handy little text box filter. Well, you notice when you do that, that revenue summarization and that sales summarization does not change. It's not respecting that filter because that filter is being done in what we call client-side interactions. The summarization itself was computed ahead of time before the table was actually rendered. And unlike in Shiny, there's no direct communication between what the user is doing on the filtering side and the underlying R function that created that summarization. Well, have no fear, folks. If you're willing to invest in a little JavaScript knowledge here, you can have a dynamically updating summarization with JavaScript code. Now, this is where, if you're new to JavaScript, it'll look maybe a little different at first, but once you get the hang of it, I think you can do little basic things like this without too much trouble. But the example blog post, of course, has the code where Albert is defining a custom JavaScript function that initializes an empty total of 0, and then basically for each row that's currently present using this state object. Again, the state is like what JavaScript sees as what the user is seeing in that table. So for example, if they're creating a filter, they're just going to see what that state object is just going to represent, what is actually showing on that table. Great. So he takes that, and then for each of the rows that are in that state of the filter, he's going to add up the values based on the column ID that's being supplied here, and then return that total. So he does that for both the sales and the revenue, along with some formatting of the revenue using some JavaScript, functions as well, which again, you can see in the in the blog post. And there you go. Now when you do that filtering, I'll even type it while I'm recording here. Sure enough, when I filter for January, that total is now updating accordingly. So this is terrific, a terrific way to make sure that you get that shiny-like experience. But again, this is all done in client side, and Reactable has JavaScript bindings that you can customize as much or as little as you like. Lastly, speaking of making things look good, Albert wants to change the style of those, what I call nested group rows, versus the rows of the actual data itself. His first attempt at this actually ends up coloring every row in the same color, which kind of defeats the purpose, doesn't it? But that's an artifact of using this this theme function with the reactable theme function, and that by proxy is selecting every row for that theme. So, that's not quite good. What can we do differently? Well, again, we can go in the JavaScript world where he defines a JavaScript function to say, you know what? I'm going to take the row itself, which is called row info. It's like metadata for the rows each of the table. And for each of these groups, that first row, which is just showing the quarter name and whatnot, that's level 0. Remember, JavaScript index start at 0, not 1, like an R, so that might trip you up a bit. But he's saying if that level is 0 that's being shown, then do the custom background on the cell, color. Otherwise, leave the rest the heck alone. And sure enough, at the end product, you've got those quarter rows with that nice little, shading, so you can quickly visually distinguish those from the actual data cells as well. And last but not least, he does a little change up to the style of the footer. And this is, again, very simple to do. Again, a little bit of CSS demonstrated here, where you can add a footer style with custom CSS function from the HTML tools package, or you can give it like the font weight, and in this case, a little line at the top called border top. So you can quickly see, just like you might be writing this on paper, putting a line under the numbers you're calculating, and then making sure that visually pops out. So again, a tour de force of how you can take a native reactable table that just comes with that data frame being fed into it, all the way to a very nice, polished, and again, highly interactive, multiple levels table for you to look at. Again, Reactable and GT, wonderful packages for creating tables. Albert's been doing a lot of content on each of these, so you want to check out the archive of his posts, or of his blog, I should say, for many other posts that talk about using these great packages in action. So I am thrilled to see this. highlights today is another great showcase of another awesome piece of technology using a framework that's quite familiar to those that have been in the R Markdown ecosystem to save you a bunch of time and a lot of future effort. And yeah, I think future you will thank you for investing in such techniques. We are specifically speaking about the Quarto publication system, which has been a hot topic ever since it was announced at PositConf back earlier in 2022. Can't believe it's been that long, but yeah, Quarto's been around a little bit already. And in particular, it has a lot of functionalities under the hood, but one of those, which has definitely been inspired by the R Markdown predecessor, is the idea of creating parameterized reports, in that you can compile a report and feed into it a set of values, i.e. parameters, to maybe update or dynamically change some content depending on those parameters. And one of the real innovative thought leaders in this space of taking advantage of parameterized reporting from the R Markdown ecosystem and now Quarto is the author of this latest blog post on the Posit blog, JD Ryan, who has had quite a career transition, I must say, as she has gone from being literally in the field, or you might say in the streams, working in the Washington State Department of Agriculture as an environmental technician, and now she is leveraging her data science skills more in the, I guess, an office type environment. But I had the great pleasure of seeing JD again at the aforementioned PositConf earlier this month. And I must say, for the many conversations we had, whether it was at the data science hangout or, here pepping me up for my talk, or even afterwards as the conference is winding down, yeah, her energy is infectious, and sometimes I wonder, where can I get that energy? Where can I get that? Where's that fountain of youth that she seems to be drinking from? But nonetheless, it was great to touch base with her, and yes, she was kind enough to give me a little sticker too. And by the way, if you want some awesome swag, if you're a cats lover like she and I are, and you want to flaunt R at the same time, you want to check out her awesome little shop on Etsy, which I'll link to in the show notes. Nonetheless, JD has been in this world of creating parameterized reports for quite some time, and she mentions how much it's been extremely helpful as she was transitioning to her data science role in terms of creating in upwards of hundreds of these reports for farmers across the area based on their particular data needs. And instead of hard coding all this one by one, for, like I said, over 300 of these, she was able to leverage the parameter functionality to create both interactive and static or PDF versions of these reports and have them dynamically render in a batch setting. So how do you actually get there? That's where the meat of the post dives in here, where there are different kind of high-level goals that you want to look at depending on how far you want to take it. Obviously, if you only have a few reports, maybe manual is the better effort for you, and that might be what you're used to. But then, like I said, the scale starts to escalate. If you find yourself regenerating a lot of these things manually, that's when you want to start investing into the idea of parameterized reports. So how do they actually work? Well, no matter if you're doing a report based in R or based in Python, you will have a capacity to be able to specify these parameters either in the front matter YAML of that Quarto report if you're leveraging the knitter engine, i.e. using R, or if you're in the Jupyter setting, if you're leveraging Python, you can do a specific code chunk with an optional tag attribute called parameters, and you can literally just type in the values one by one. Obviously, the parameter values are more optimized for, textual type parameters, maybe numbers. You're probably not going to be able to use complex classes because it's got to be something that can be specified in text by the renderer. But once you have that going and once you have those parameters defined, then you have many different ways to actually compile this. First of which is within an IDE like RStudio or leveraging the Quarto extension in VS Code or Positron. You can compile the report and it will use the default values of those parameters that you specified. so you can get a feel for if the parameters are working as expected. And so another option is maybe you want to keep those default values as is, but you want to experiment with changing maybe one or two of them. Well, Quarto is not like a R package like R Markdown was. It is actually a utility, a software utility on its own with its own command line interface. So you can run the Quarto render function and feed in the Quarto Markdown document. You might call it template. And then you can specify one or more parameter values with the $P flag, and then give the name of the parameter, a colon, and then that parameter value. So that's a great way if you don't want to change your default parameters and you want to get a quick take on maybe changing those parameters on the fly, you can quickly do that. Or if you don't want to type those command line flags, you can have a separate YAML file called params.yaml, where then you can simply put them, much like you would in that frontender YAML for the default parameter settings, and just in the Quarto render call, use the --execute -params flag, feed in that YAML, and now you've got, again, that report compiled using those new values. And there is more, of course. If you are in the R ecosystem, there is the Quarto R package, which again is not the Quarto engine itself. It's just, you can think of it as like an API type package to the Quarto static rendering engine, where then that has an execute _params argument, and you can feed the parameters as a list object, and then feeding as input the name of the file that you're going to render. So you can do that from R itself. And now the wheels are probably turning here. You got all these different ways of executing and compiling the report with parameters. What are ways you can actually automate that? Well, there are a few techniques here, and I've used a couple of these already, but they're really, really solid. One of which is to have a data frame, which has all the combinations of the parameters that you're interested in rendering as each row. So in her example, she's got a year, a producer ID, and literally does a expand grid of these 2 year values and 4 ID values, and you'll get then this 8-row data frame with each of those parameter combinations. That's pretty straightforward, and what you do with that is you can augment then the different output formats you want. Maybe it's HTML, and then the actual file name using a little paste magic, and then you can have then a nested column that has these parameter values as lists, i.e. the columns that are already in this data frame, and make it a named list. And she's got a nice little snippet of code that does this with the per package. Another one I simply can't live without. And again, if you love your cats, then how can you not love the per package? So it seems like fit for purpose here. Then once you have that, then you can have a customized, tidy kind of data frame organized by 1 row per iteration. And then back to per, you can use the handy function called pwalk, which you can feed in the data frame itself. And then that basically means that each column of the data frame is like a function parameter. That can get fed into the Quarto render function. And those parameters are going to be fed very clearly as named arguments. So again, this may take a little getting used to, but again, you can leverage her snippets of code that she has in the post and try it out for yourself. And this can be part of a larger scale pipeline. Just imagine that you want to do these on a routine basis. So you can find ways to automate this. Heck, Quarto is a first-class citizen output format of the targets package that I speak so highly about. You could leverage something like this in your targets reports as well. There are lots of interesting ways you can use this technique, again, to save you a boatload of time and effort in the future. So JD definitely has a lot more materials than what this blog post has here, and she's done a workshop about this in the past. She's done a presentation at PositConf last year about this workflow and how it applied to her daily work. So yeah, you'll be invited to check those out as well. And again, love the cat pics in this. Makes me miss my cats from the yesteryear, but nonetheless, really great blog post by JD here. You can tell it's got all the bells and whistles of Quarto itself in the blog post because it got a nice little tabbed interface to go from the R snippet for that automated execution to a bash scripting, which links to another blog post by Solomon Moon, who talks about how you can do this in a bash script. So again, whatever your flavor is, she's got you covered with different examples here. And if that wasn't enough, boy, this issue's got a whole bunch in here that we wish we could cover today in its entirety. But yeah, time's not unlimited, unfortunately. But you can find all the additional resources at rweekly.org. And we'll take a minute here to talk about one of my additional finds that I think might be worth looking at as you listen to the show and afterwards. And we heard announced at PosiConf in one of the talks a wonderful new extension for Quarto called Close Read. And what this is giving you is a way to have that kind of scrolly telling functionality in your Quarto report that you often see in these websites that are kind of this hybrid of infographics and other, neat utilities. And the way you scroll through it, it kind of updates the content dynamically based on where you're at. It maybe freezes certain elements. Well, this extension, Close Read, is really, really great in this space. We haven't really had we've had attempts at this before in the R community, but I think this one really nails it. So this link is from Georgios Kamaranis. I believe he also gave a talk at PosiConf. And this is a visual journey through world exhibitions. And you kind of have to see it to believe it. I can't do enough justice on the audio form. But it's got this great interactive map that, depending on where you're going in the story, it's going to zoom in on different regions when it talks about the narrative behind these different exhibits. It'll splice in some authentic pictures from these exhibits. But it's a great showcase of what is possible with Close Read. And I am definitely going to take a look at this as I think about content that can be engaging to different audiences. I mean, gosh, my wish is I could do something like this in life sciences. I'm not sure if that type of material would be fit for it, but hey, you never know. Maybe so. But maybe I could find some other uses for it. But Close Read is still early days, but it looks like a few people are already putting it through the paces. In fact, I saw another contributor to Art Weekly highlights in the past, Nicola Rennie, has also done an example of her Tidy Tuesday visualization in a Close Read document as well. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. So starting to see it in the wild, and I'm definitely interested in seeing where uses of that extension end up going. And yeah, like I said, there's a lot more to this issue, but we're going to have to wrap things up here as we're winding down. But of course, I like to always close with telling you how you can get involved to help the project as well as this very podcast. First, where can you get involved with R Weekly? Well, again, visit rweekly.org, and we welcome all your contributions to that great new blog post showcasing R and data science, maybe a great new package that you discovered or something that's had a new release, a great workshop tutorial, maybe another podcast or videos out there. Either way, there are different categories for each of these type of content, and the best way to do that is via a pull request, already linked in the top right corner in that handy little ribbon on the R Weekly site. You click that, you'll be taken to a predefined template. You'll fill out a little bit of metadata, and all we need is a link, all marked down all the time. Just like when you're writing that fancy Quarto parameterized report, you use a markdown for that too. So we invite you to share your resources on there, and the curator of the week will be glad to merge that in. And also, we are definitely open for curator spots as well. We would love to hear from you on that front. We have details on the process at rweekly.org, and that will take you to the GitHub repo, where we have a nice README that's been put together about how to get involved on the curation front. And also, we love to hear from you on this very podcast. So we have a little contact page directly in the show notes that you can use to quickly send myself and Mike a message. You can also, if you're on a modern podcast app, some of my favorites are Podverse and Fountain. Also for iOS users, Cast-O-Matic, I hear great things about. With one of those apps, you can send us a fun little boost along the way that goes directly to us on the podcast team and no middle party involved. So that's available as well. But also you can find me on the social medias out there. I'm mostly on Mastodon these days at our podcast at podcastindex.social. And I did have a good friend of mine on one of the other communities I'm a part of trying to figure out the best way to get started with Mastodon. If that is something you as well are trying to get into, I'll put a link to a couple great write-ups that I found helpful in the community if you're new to your Mastodon journey, because I'm starting to see a lot of my friends from data science and the R community are starting to get on Mastodon, but the key is finding the best way to get in touch with them so you can find their content. So I'll have some resources about that in the show notes of this episode. You can also find me on LinkedIn as well. Just search for my name and you'll find me on there. And somewhat sporadically on the Weapon X thingy with at the Rcast. Well, that'll do it for this episode of our Weekly Highlights. Can't believe we're at episode 176 already. Gosh, 200's not that far away. So hopefully we'll get there one way or another, I hope. But again, next week, I'll hope to have my trusty companion here, Mike, back on the mic with me. So that will be, a welcome change instead of just hearing me blab all by myself. In any event, we're going to close up shop here. That will wrap up episode 176 of our Weekly Highlights. And we'll be back with a new episode next week.